Vice President of Communications for J Street, welcoming you to this YouTube conversation with Matt Duss, our guest, who's graciously agreed to come over to our offices in Washington, D.C. and talk to us about the situation in Gaza. And it's a very timely conversation because we've just heard a short time ago about the new open-ended ceasefire that has been reached in Cairo that will hopefully end this particular stage of conflict. Our guest, Matt Duss, is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace based in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress, where his work focused on the Middle East and U.S. national security. Matt, thanks very much for coming in.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So let's talk, first of all, about this ceasefire, and what do we know about it?
Well, what we know right now is that as of 7 o'clock local time, which is noon D.C. time, although I think this may have been extended an hour, is that we'll have a ceasefire. Hamas will cease rocket fire and mortar fire from inside Gaza into Israel, and Israel will cease its operations, bombing, strikes, etc. In Gaza. The immediate conditions that I've seen are that Israel will increase the fishing zone to 8 miles, and that there will be they will allow humanitarian goods, and so they will ease the closure on Gaza somewhat, just to allow emergency humanitarian medical supplies, etc. At a later stage, within several weeks, there will be further talks relating to the opening of the seaport, perhaps an airport in Gaza. These are demands that Hamas has made, in various of their ceasefire proposals over the past few weeks.
So what makes us think that this ceasefire agreement will be more durable than the 2 or 3 previous ones, which were for limited time periods and expired, and obviously the last one was violated and led to yet a week more of war and destruction?
Right. I mean, it seems to me that there was, first of all, a great deal of disagreement within Hamas about when finally to accept a ceasefire and on what terms. I think there was agreement that an agreement to end the closure substantially, or at least ease it substantially, was a necessary condition for them to accept ceasefire. And I think they feel that they have confidence, it seems, that they're going to get that. And I think it's important to remind viewers that this was a condition of the 2012 ceasefire, easing the closure, allowing for greater imports and eventually exports, which is a huge problem. Not being able to export any goods and therefore not be able to have any economic development is a huge problem for Gaza. But it was an element of the 2012 ceasefire that was delayed and eventually just ignored. So while I think it's worth making sure that we try and deny, we don't want to reward Hamas obviously for its tactic, its deplorable tactic of firing rockets into civilian areas. I think we have to try and separate that from the fact that easing the closure on Gaza is the only way we can kind of move forward into a better situation.
Now, obviously, the big loser from this conflict have been the people who live in Gaza, the civilians who have suffered a tremendous amount of death and destruction and injury and loss of property and loss of homes. But in just geopolitical terms, can we say that one side or the other is there a winner or a loser between Israel and Hamas, or is it just the two have kind of knocked themselves into a state where neither one of them wants to continue, but there's no clear winner or loser?
Well, I think the latter. It's hard to say that there is any winner here today. I think what we've seen is just a kind of reversion to a status quo, or that's what we want to avoid. Hamas is claiming already that it showed that when Israel invades Gaza, it can incur serious Israeli casualties. It was able to kill a number of Israeli soldiers, over 60, which in their view, they did far better this time than they did in Kaslet. But Israel, on the other hand, showed, I think to no one's surprise, that when it wants to, it can inflict serious damage on the Gaza Strip. But I think what this shows is that this status quo of quiet, and then every 2 years or so, another round of fighting where Israel carries out its, what it calls mowing the lawn, just kind of diminishing Hamas's ability, responding to rocket fire by diminishing its store of rockets and taking out some targets and killing some Hamas leaders. This really isn't solving the problem. So I think we really need to kind of push for a better solution that changes this status quo. And I think one of the ways to do that is to, and I'm happy to see, first of all, that President Obama has recognized this, the need to ease the Gaza closure. But even Netanyahu himself, in a press conference several weeks ago, indicated that he would support putting PA forces under Abbas's authority back into Gaza in Rafah, which brings us to the issue of the Hamas-Fatah unity agreement. And I think that any way out of this, a situation which doesn't lead back to another round in 2 years, is going to have to act within the context of that unity.
And part of this agreement is, in fact, for the insertion of PA troops on the Rafah border.
Right.
So what do you think the prospects are of that actually happening? Who benefits from that, apart from, obviously, the PA?
Mm-hmm.
So are the Egyptians likely to be happy with that? Is Hamas likely to be happy with that?
Well, I think Hamas, any kind of devolution of its own authority, it's going to be uncomfortable with, but at the same time, we have to think about the reasons why it entered into the unity agreement when it did earlier this year, several months ago, just because of the pressure on them. They wanted, first of all, to kind of ease the pressure on themselves because they've lost all of their patrons over the past several years, Syria, Iran, others, and are now, we're looking for an opportunity to get, to ease some of the political pressure on themselves and try to put some of that pressure on the Palestinian Authority, responsibility for, say, paying civil servants, but trying to do that while giving up the least amount of power in Gaza that they could. A very tricky undertaking. So I think there will be a real challenge and resistance on Hamas's part to giving up authority and handing over, I think, authority at Rafah to the Palestinian Authority. But I think, this is where the United States and its partners, certainly Egypt, wants to see Hamas weaker. Sisi, the president of Egypt, has made this clear numerous times, both in word and deed. But I think we've got an opportunity here. You have the EU assistance mission, which was created after the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 to kind of train and equip and oversee Palestinian forces at the Rafah crossing as a way of ensuring, keeping Israel confident that this would be a responsible undertaking. But they've offered and extended their mandate for one more year. Several weeks ago, the UK, France, and Germany announced that they'd be willing to support a reinvigoration of that assistance mission. So it seems like there are some pieces lining up here, but when it comes to getting Hamas to accept this, I think it's a big challenge.
Right. And looking at Israel, there was an interesting poll done by TV Channel 2, which was published last night, that showed that Netanyahu's approval rating for his handling of this conflict had plummeted. It was standing at 82% just a few weeks ago and had gone down to 38%. What do you think is behind that?
Well, I have to think at least part of it is that, for the first few weeks you had statements from members of the government, op-eds published by people like former Ambassador Michael Oren here in the Washington Post, saying that Israel must crush Hamas, that presenting this, kind of setting that up as a goal. Well, I think it's very clear to all of us who've followed this and understand what Israel's real requirements are, is that they don't want to crush Hamas, they sort of need Hamas, because after Hamas, the alternatives are much worse. There are worse groups than Hamas waiting and anxious to fill any void where Hamas to completely collapse in the Gaza Strip. But having set up that very elevated goal there, when it became clear, as it certainly is clear now, that this operation will end, or that Netanyahu is very much willing to have it end, absent, having fallen very short of defeating Hamas, as many people were claiming he should, I think that's kind of what we see reflected here.
In the past in the Middle East, some conflicts have actually opened a way to peace developments. One thinks of the Yom Kippur War, which 3 years or 4 years later led to Sadat's visit to Jerusalem. Do you think this is one of these paradigm-shifting moments, or is it just a question of these sides have knocked each other senseless and they're just going to rebuild and recoup and wait for the next round?
Well, I think in the absence of a little bit of both leadership encouragement and pressure from the United States and the EU, we could very easily see the latter, where parties just kind of retreat to their corners, where some small steps are taken, where the closure is sort of tweaked a little bit here and there, but in general is kept in place, and then we're back at it because the root causes of this are not addressed. So this is where I would say that the U.S. and its partners, particularly the EU, have some important work to do. I mean, the president, again, has made clear that he sees the easing of the closure as an important goal here. The administration indicated its willingness to work with the unity government made up of unaffiliated technocrats that was announced several months ago. So I think there are signs that there's a way to go about this to lead to a broader opportunity. But clearly there's some big issues on both sides. You have to get into the actual mechanics of what a kind of unity government looks like. You get to the problem of Hamas's own positions, its own highly offensive charter. Even though I would mention here, Khalid Mashal, in an interview that was published I think yesterday or the day before, made one of his sort of periodic statements where he kind of distanced himself from the charter, saying, okay, that the charter was from 1989, this is 2014. Now certainly that's not enough. You don't want to count that and say, okay, he's disavowed the charter. They haven't done that. But Hamas leaders at various times have indicated that they would be willing to sign a long-term truce. They've made statements that indicate they're not entirely hostile to a two-state solution if that were accepted by the Palestinian people themselves. So I think there are ways to test what we can do. So I would say that this is a moment where the administration, I would hope, they would be very engaged to see what those possibilities are. On the Israeli side, you look at the makeup of this current government, and it does not seem to me to be one that is going to take really big, bold steps toward a lasting peace agreement. You have parties such as Bennett's party, sorry, and then Lieberman, and who have just against a Palestinian state, full stop. You even have Netanyahu, who in his Bar Ilan speech said that he was for a two-state solution, issued a lot of caveats that raised questions whether that was just he was saying it but not really supporting it. But a few weeks ago, after the fighting in Gaza started, he issued a statement, or he was in a press conference where he said this shows that we can never withdraw from the West Bank. So I'm not sure.
He said it again last week.
And he said it again. So if he's now saying that Israel can never withdraw from the West Bank, I'm not sure if we're really left with anything to work with regard to a two-state solution. That's something the United States needs to explore as well.
We'll come on to that in a second, but first I want to, staying in Gaza, one of the provisions of the reconciliation agreement between Fatah and Hamas was that there would be elections both in the West Bank and Gaza. How realistic is it that Hamas would allow a democratic election to take place in Gaza, since they basically have been instituted one-party rule and have not allowed political life to develop in any democratic way?
Yeah. Well, I think before this war, it was seen as very, very, this was one of the biggest challenges. That the government that was created was ostensibly a transitional government that was going to be in power until we got to elections, but that was the big question. Okay, when are these elections? I think they were supposed to be 6 months after, but I would assume this is going to be kicked down the road a little bit. The elections have already been continually kicked down the road. The Palestinian Authority itself is way overdue for elections. But I think there is an understanding that disunity, and this is where the Palestinian people themselves, who have consistently reported Palestinian unity as a major goal. I think that it consistently polls over the past several years at 70 to 80, even 90% as a priority, is ending the division between Fatah and Hamas. So I think making that point, Hamas, as its authoritarian tendencies to the side, Hamas has shown that it does take stock of popular opinion. I think it's not quite true just to treat them solely as a terrorist organization, although they are that. There are other things as well. They're a political organization that does pay attention to Palestinian public opinion. So I think with that opinion being so much in support of Palestinian unity, as a way to create sort of legitimacy for a body that can genuinely speak for Palestinians as a whole. I would see this very much, first of all, in the Palestinian interest, in the U.S. interest as well, given that this administration and previous ones have said that a final resolution is in the U.S. interest. But I think my question is how, first of all, how you get Hamas, in a position where they'll accept elections, but also what is going to be the Israeli government's position on those elections.
Now, the ceasefire was not the only significant development that was happening today. There were reports that President Abbas was going to make an important statement this evening. And so what can you tell us about that?
Well, from what I've read and heard, it was going to be yet another vote of no confidence in the U.S. brokered peace process. This was, what we saw is, the bid at the UN where they successfully elevated the Palestine status from non-member observer entity to non-member observer state. I think, it's important to understand here that what's driving this, first of all, is, the failure of the Kerry Initiative, which Abbas entered almost completely alone among the leadership. He was opposed by all of those closest to him. He alone sort of said, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to trust Kerry. We're going to give this a chance to work. But when it collapsed, he was left, scrambling to find something that could help boost his political popularity. And I think that's even more so now in the wake of this of the war, which for all the destruction it did bring to the Palestinian people in Gaza and in the West Bank too. I think people need to be aware that there have been a continuing wave of arrests and house demolitions and incursions in the West Bank, even as everyone's attention is focused on Gaza. I think in the wake of this, even though there was an enormous amount of destruction and casualties in Gaza, it's the dynamic is sort of favoring Hamas in the sense that they are the ones who are seen as representing the true resistance, the ones who are seen who are seen the most motivated. Now that may sound strange given that they brought a lot of destruction and pain onto Gaza, but in an understanding that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are both so frustrated with the status quo and see repeated efforts to change that status quo fail, they're almost in a situation where any party who can conceivably change the status quo in any way and at almost any cost, they would favor that. So I think this is the way we have to understand what Abbas is doing. He's seen that his efforts to work with the U.S. in that process have not produced anything. So he's going to try to take yet another move outside of that context and work within the UN and other international organizations to see if that's a way for him to create any leverage in this process and produce actual goods for the Palestinians.
Do you see him going to the International Criminal Court and asking for jurisdiction over the territories?
I tend to be pretty skeptical of that. It's not to say we won't see it. I think my view is that he sees that almost as more useful as a threat than as an actual threat that's followed through. Although we saw Hamas actually sign onto this this request now to add their names to, saying yes, Abbas, you should do this, which is kind of strange because, as everyone should understand, Hamas is quite culpable themselves for war crimes, and if Palestine would would enter itself into the jurisdiction of the ICC, then Hamas and other extremist groups are quite likely to be held responsible as well.
So we talked about the Israeli opinion poll that showed Netanyahu's support falling dramatically. Do you see a similar kind of mechanism in Gaza once the war is over? While the fighting is going on, everyone rallies behind the resistance, but now it's over and people emerge from their refuges and their hiding places and see the scale of destruction. Will Hamas be held accountable?
Well, I think this is a really important and sensitive moment because we've had a dynamic over the past several years where Hamas, whether it's through kidnappings or through rocket fire, has actually been able to plausibly argue that their violence produces results. They were able to get 1,000 prisoners released in exchange for Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier who was held starting in 2006. Now we will very likely see them. They're already claiming victory because of the agreement to ease the closure. So I think what we need to do is try to create a framework where any benefits that come to Gaza's people are accrued to the Palestinian Authority rather than Hamas. To take the opposite tack, on the West Bank, you look at Abbas, and this goes to the point I was making earlier about his own political troubles and the pressures he's under. He's been making an argument for years now that the way to achieve Palestinian national goals are through nonviolence, through negotiation, through talks, and he has nothing to show for it. He's entered round after round of talks. He has gone, and all he has to show for it is more occupation and more settlements, whereas Hamas can plausibly argue that their violence has produced actual tangible goods. Now, that might not be a convincing argument to you and me. I can see how it might be to people in Gaza if you go back to what I said about just any effort to change the status quo. So I think the next few weeks are going to be really important, where we should. I think the U.S. goal should be and I mean, we want to be careful about trying to, dip our hand into Palestinian politics and kind of empower other people at the expense of others, but I would say the U.S. does have an interest, and frankly, Israel has an interest, clearly, in Abbas being empowered over Hamas, even though some of the steps that Israel continues to take in the West Bank, I would suggest, humiliate and weaken Abbas, and that really needs to change. But the goal should be to make sure that any benefits that accrue to Gazans in Gaza as a result of the ceasefire, we need to look for ways to make sure those benefits are delivered through the Palestinian Authority.
Let's look at the U.S. role in this. I think that the first weekend of this war, John Kerry goes on the Sunday shows, and he's caught in a kind of open mic situation, talking about we have to get the hell over there. So off he goes and tries to negotiate, and doesn't succeed, and retreats back to Washington, and then it's really the Egyptians who do the heavy lifting. What's going on here? Why was Kerry so unable to play a central role in negotiating the end of this conflict? Why was he left out of the circle?
Well, I think we saw a really interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was last week or the week before, about the great identity of interest between the current Egyptian government and the Israeli government right now. This Egyptian government is very, very hostile to Hamas. Under Mubarak, Egypt's intelligence chief played kind of a brokering role. He wasn't a big fan of Hamas, but he wasn't nearly as hostile as this government is. And then, of course, we had the Muslim Brotherhood government of Mohammed Morsi that was far more conciliatory toward Hamas, although it's worth noting they had their own interests in preventing Gaza from being pushed onto Egypt and made Egypt's problem. Morsi acted against the smuggling tunnels in the south of Gaza, for example, much more vigorously than Mubarak did, which is really interesting. But you had a situation where Egypt and Israel felt, or Israel felt it had more to gain from coordinating more closely with Egypt than from U.S. involvement. I mean, I think you remember when Kerry announced that he was going to go over there and try to broker a ceasefire, you had some Israeli leaders saying, well, who invited him? They felt that their interests were being served by allowing Egypt's complete monopoly of the process. And I think we're seeing now, or we should see, that's not quite right. When you have an Egypt that is just completely hostile to Hamas and makes it very, very clear that they're going to do everything they can to weaken and hurt Hamas. Well, if you need an agreement from Hamas to have a ceasefire, which you do, it stands to reason they're just not going to be so confident in the enforcement of Egypt's ability to follow through on its own commitments. If Egypt has completely stated flat out that their goal is to weaken Hamas, so I think there's an interesting way in which that actually worked against Israel's interests.
Going back to April, when the Kerry initiative collapsed, the United States said it was going to leave the parties just for some time to kind of stew in their own juices. And there were some people who said basically Obama's done with this issue. He's got a lot of other things on his plate. Clearly he has. What are the chances of the United States actually re-engaging and taking this moment and trying another push for a two-state solution?
I would not say they're great. I wouldn't say that they're non-existent. I think there's an opportunity here. We have, according to the reports that I saw yesterday, Abbas is saying that he has Arab support for this new initiative. But we also have the Arab Peace Initiative out there. And again, I think it needs to be more understood both, by Americans, that you do have this offer of complete normalization and peace by the Arab League that's been out there since 2002, and then it was reaffirmed, I think it was 2006 or 7. I mean, you do have the makings of a regional peace initiative here, and I'd say when you look at other things that are happening in the region, ISIS obviously being one of the biggest problems. I think there's a way that a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians could have some very, very positive effects region-wide. I don't want to make it, too much of a huge bonus for the region. I think it's quite possible to do that, but I do think it's one area in which U.S. leadership is essential. And I know that's kind of J Street's basic theory of the case. It's one that I agree with very, very much. But I think the United States is so both involved and invested in a resolution at this point that I would say this is really, it seems to me, a key moment where we need to start thinking through ways that we could, as I think the comparison you made to the Yom Kippur War is a very good one, whether in the wake of this latest conflict we can really take steps that will change this status quo, which is a deteriorating and dangerous one.
Right. And last week, and there's obviously before the ceasefire, there was a report in Haaretz that Britain, France, and Germany, with US backing, wanted to bring a new resolution to the Security Council. And the aim was to get a ceasefire, which obviously we have now, but also to build on it, to reconstruct Gaza, and then to pivot to doing something about the two-state solution. Do you think that approach is still alive, or has it become moot because the parties have decided to agree to a ceasefire?
Well, no, I think I hope it is still alive, just because a ceasefire is it's only the first step in a process that I agree with. I mean, I think you need to address the closure, you need to address the economic development and reconstruction in Gaza, and as part of that, you need to end the division that has been cultivated between Gaza and the West Bank, working on easing restrictions on travel. The restrictions on travel between the West Bank and Gaza are very, very heavy right now. Gazans cannot travel to the West Bank and vice versa, except for the most extreme medical or humanitarian reasons. And I think if we're interested in a viable Palestinian state, as the U.S. certainly is, or should be, then cultivating, bringing back those relationships, allowing for that travel, allowing for those political institutions to end. You essentially have two competing Palestinian states, or proto-states, I guess you would say, in Gaza and the West Bank, and I think that division just has to be ended. So there are a lot of things that we can do in the immediate term, whether it's import and export of goods or simply movement of people, kids being able to go to college from Gaza to go to the West Bank, etc., that we can do to kind of prepare the ground for an eventual agreement, even if that it doesn't seem that right now.
Right. Okay, Matt, thank you again for your time and your expertise and your work. Matt Duss is a great friend of J Street, and we really appreciate that. This is the first in a series of conversations that we are planning to have, and the next one will be on September 4th, which is next Wednesday, 2 days after Labor Day, at 1 p.m. with a member of Knesset Horowitz, a member of the Labour Party. I don't think we'll be doing it by video. We'll be doing it probably by conference call, but we'll be sending out invitations later this week with all the details, and we hope that you can join us for that. Once again, deep thanks to Matt Duss. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.